Ancient Greece in 10 minutes. Minoan civilization emerges on the island of Crete around 2700 BC with evidence suggesting they were the first Europeans to use linear script, which unfortunately we can't read yet. Mycenaean civilization then takes shape on the Peloponnese around 1600 BC with their own script known as Linear B, which is a precursor to the Greek alphabet. But this still remains undeciphered. By 1100 BC, both of these Bronze Age civilizations have collapsed. But unlike their collapse in the Middle East, there was no massive influx of people from the East to take their place. Instead, Greece entered what is known as the Greek Dark Ages. The Greek Dark Ages refers to the period between the end of the Mycenaean civilization and the beginning of the Archaic period, which saw the rise of city-states. During this time, Greece didn't really advance much technologically or culturally. There are some exceptions like the emergence of the epic poem tradition with Homer. But overall, this was a pretty rough time for Greece. So let's just skip forward to the Archaic period, shall we? During the Archaic period, starting around 800 BC, Greece experienced a massive cultural and intellectual flourishing known as the Greek Renaissance. Now don't get me wrong, the Mycenaeans had impressive architecture, but the Archaic Greeks took things to a whole new level with temples like the Temple of Artemis and the Temple of Apollo. These monumental structures served not only as places of worship, but also as a reflection of the wealth and power of the city-state they represented. In fact, it was during this time that Greek architecture became known for its grandeur and sophistication. The Doric order emerged, followed by the Ionic order and later the Corinthian order, each one more ornate than the last. And even though we won't be talking about them today, the Greeks also made some pretty sick sculptures too, like the Critios boy. I mean, look at that pose. Very swag. But anyway, during the Archaic period, the Greeks also developed the world's first alphabets. Yep, instead of being passed down from the Phoenicians. Greeks actually invented their own alphabets independently, probably because they were like, hey, we kind of need a way to write stuff down so we can keep track of our sweet olive oil trades. Before this, the Greeks used Linear B, which was a pain in the butt to write with because it had no vowels. So they came up with this phonetic alphabet that had both consonants and vowels, making writing much easier. It wasn't long before this new invention spread throughout the Greek world. The Greeks basically had a monopoly on writing at the time, which meant they could spread their culture far and wide through things like epic poetry. Speaking of epic poetry, during the Archaic period, the Greeks also produced some of their most famous epic poems, including the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. These poems were not only entertaining, but also served as a way to transmit cultural values and historical events to the next generation. Poems often dealt with themes of war, heroism, and adventure, reflecting the values of the ancient Greek society. They were typically performed orally with the poet accompanied by a lyre, creating a sense of community and shared identity among the listeners. But despite their popularity, it is important to note that the exact authorship of these poems is actually a subject of debate among scholars. Some believe that they were written by a single author, while others argue that they were the product of a more collaborative effort. Regardless, these epic poems remain cornerstones of ancient Greek literature. Another major development during the Archaic period was the rise of philosophy. Now people usually think that Socrates was the first philosopher, but he actually built off the work of earlier thinkers like Thales and Anaximander. These pre-Socratic philosophers were really into asking questions about the nature of the universe and reality. They were like, yo, what's the deal with this world? What's it made of? And their answers often involved the concept known as the arch, a supposed fundamental substance that everything else was made of. Like Thales believed that water was the arch, but Anaximander thought it was something more abstract called the apeiron. Anyway, these philosophers weren't just coming up with random ideas. They were trying to develop a rational and systematic understanding of the world, which was a pretty new way of thinking at the time. They relied on logic and reason rather than mythology or tradition to explain how things worked, which would heavily influence the development of Western philosophy. Though it's worth noting that many of these early philosophers were also interested in science and mathematics. Pythagoras, for example, and his homies were really into numbers and geometry. In fact, they believed that numbers held a kind of mystical significance and that the universe itself was governed by mathematical principles. But I mean, who needs math when you've got the Olympics? The ancient Olympic Games were an important part of Greek culture, but they actually started out as a local festival in honor of Zeus. However, in 708 BC, it was decided that everyone in Greece could participate in the games every 4 years, which turned it into a massive pan-Hellenic festival attracting athletes and spectators from all over. The Olympics included a variety of competitions such as running, wrestling, and chariot racing, which took place over 5 days. But it wasn't just about the competition. The Olympic truce was an important part of the event as it allowed for safe passage of athletes and spectators traveling to and from the games. It was a chance for rival states to come together and celebrate their shared Greek identity. But unfortunately, as the Roman Empire grew, the importance of the Olympics declined until they were eventually abolished in the 4th century AD. And that brings us to the classical period, which is widely regarded as the golden age of ancient Greece. This was the time when Athens reached its peak under the rule of Pericles. Athens became a beacon of democracy, culture, and art. But don't get me wrong, Athens was by no means perfect. Slavery was still a thing and women still couldn't vote. But compared to other city-states, Athens was pretty progressive with its system of government. Most adult male citizens had the right to vote and hold office, and Athens also had a strong emphasis on education. It led to the construction of the world's first public library at the School of Salamis. But Athens' greatness didn't last forever. In 431 BC, the Peloponnesian War broke out between Athens and Sparta, which resulted in the decline of Athenian power and prestige. The war lasted for 27 years and it was super brutal. Sparta was backed by most of the other Greek city-states and they had a strong military, with a focus on discipline and endurance. Athens, on the other hand, had a navy and relied on its wealth and resources to support its war efforts. The war was a stalemate for most of its duration, but eventually Sparta came out on top with the help of their secret weapon, the Helot Revolt. This was when the Helots, who were the Spartan slaves, rebelled against their masters. This gave Sparta an advantage because they had to divert some of their resources to put down the rebellion. In the end, the war devastated both sides and it marked the end of classical Greece. Now, after the Peloponnesian War, Greece became a lot less independent and a lot more dependent on outside powers. First, there was the 330s when Thebes briefly rose to prominence after defeating Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra. Then there was the Macedonian domination under Philip II and his son Alexander the Great. Alexander's empire stretched from Greece to India. It facilitated the spread of Greek culture to non-Greek people. But after Alexander died, his empire crumbled and Greece fell under the control of the Roman Republic. But even though Greece was no longer independent, Greek culture continued to thrive. It influenced the Romans and vice versa, and this period is known as the Hellenistic period. But I am not gonna talk about it because I already talked about it in my Rome video. So if you want to learn more about Greece during the Hellenistic period, go watch that. And then at the end of the 1400s, Greece was able to become independent again when the Ottoman Empire invaded and conquered most of the Peloponnese. So yeah, ancient Greece has a pretty rich and fascinating history, but I just covered like 3,000 years of it in like 10 minutes. So if you want to learn more, I would suggest you go check out my podcast. Thanks for watching.